The day they finally removed the cap, 3 women fainted. One elder walked out of the palace and never came back. A young boy who had been dared by his friends to peek through the doorway ran home, crawled under his sleeping mat, and refused to speak for 4 days. And the thing that disturbed the people of Karuthi most, the thing that kept the whole village awake that night, staring into the darkness with their hearts hammering against their ribs, was not what they saw beneath the cap. It was the fact that what they saw was still moving. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. If you are new here, subscribe now and turn on your notifications, because this story does not end where you think it ends. Stay with it. Every word matters. The village of Karuthi sat in the green throat of the highland valley below the great mountain, in a place where the mornings came in thick and white and cold, where the millet grew tall and amber in the long rains, and where the cattle of the people were fat and slow and moved through the grass like brown clouds. It was a place that, under different circumstances, might have been called beautiful. The earth was red and rich. The rivers ran clear. The fig trees were ancient and enormous, their roots breaking through the ground like the knuckles of buried giants. Under different circumstances. But the people of Karuthi did not speak of beauty. They did not gather in the evenings and watch the sun go down over the hills and feel anything resembling peace. They kept their eyes low and their voices quiet, and they moved through their days with the particular careful silence of people who had learned, through pain, that being noticed was dangerous. King Mwangi wa Thuita had ruled the valley for 31 years. He was not a large man. That was the first thing that surprised people who came to see him for the first time, traders from the lowlands, emissaries from neighboring kingdoms, young men brought before him for punishment. They expected someone enormous. Someone whose physical presence alone would explain the fear that preceded him everywhere like a shadow. But Mwangi wa Thuita was slight, almost thin, with long careful fingers and a face that rarely moved. He had eyes the color of old charcoal, dark and flat, and when those eyes settled on a person, that person felt it not in their chest or their stomach but somewhere deeper, somewhere that did not have a name. What everyone noticed, what everyone always noticed, was the cap. It sat on his head the way a crown sits on a king's head, with absolute authority, with no apology, with the settled permanence of something that had always been there and would always be there. It was made of dark red cloth, stitched tight across the top, with a small brim that shadowed his forehead. It was not an elaborate thing. It was not decorated with beads or feathers or the symbols of his lineage. It was plain, unremarkable. And yet it commanded more attention than anything else in the room whenever the king was present, because everyone knew, everyone had heard, that it never came off. Not at meals. Not at ceremonies. Not at the great annual feast of the first harvest when every other man in the kingdom removed his hat and poured a libation to the ancestors. The king poured his libation with the cap on his head, and nobody said a word. Not when he slept. The palace women who served his chamber whispered about it in the back rooms of the kitchen, their voices dropping to nothing when any senior servant passed. They said he slept on his back, always, perfectly still, with the cap sitting on his head like it was stitched to his skull. They said they had never, not once, glimpsed the skin of his scalp. Not even the edge of it. Not when he bathed. His bathing was done in complete privacy, attended by no one, the door bolted from the inside with a heaviness that suggested anyone who tried to open it would regret it for the remainder of their life. The cap was 31 years old, minimum. Some people said it was older. Some people said Mwangi wa Thuita had been wearing it since before he became king, since the days when he was simply the third son of the old chief, unremarkable and overlooked. They said it was the cap itself that had changed him. They said the day he put it on was the day something shifted behind those charcoal eyes. Nobody knew for certain. And nobody asked. Because the one man who had asked, a court elder named Njeru, a good man, a sensible man, a man who had served the kingdom for 40 years with nothing but faithfulness, had asked the question gently, carefully, in private, during a council meeting that had gone well. He had leaned toward the king after the others had left and said, quietly, almost tenderly, "My king, forgive an old man his curiosity. But the cap, is it perhaps a spiritual matter? Is there something the kingdom's healer should know, for your health?" Njeru was exiled 3 days later. His homestead was given to one of the king's guards. His cattle were taken. His family left with nothing but what they could carry on their backs, walking north in the early morning while the rest of the village watched from behind their doors and said nothing, because they had understood the message with perfect clarity. There were no more questions about the cap. There was, however, something that could not be stopped, something that moved through the village like groundwater, invisible and unstoppable, always finding its way through, and that was the wondering. People wondered in silence, in the privacy of their own skulls, lying in the dark beside their sleeping children and staring at the ceiling and thinking about the cap. Mothers whispered about it to their sisters in the fields when the children were far enough away not to hear. Old men thought about it while they sat in the sun outside their huts, their eyes half closed, their faces turned toward the warmth, their minds turning the question over and over like a stone worn smooth by a river. What was under it? A scar, some said. A terrible one. A wound from a battle fought before he took the throne, something that had disfigured him, something he could not bear for the world to see, because a king must be unmarked, must be whole, must present to his people the physical evidence of his favor with the gods. It was vanity, they said. Simple vanity, made dangerous by power. Others said it was ritual. That a healer had instructed him to wear the cap as part of a binding, that it was woven through with medicine, that to remove it would be to break something that had been sealed for a reason. This explanation had a certain comfort to it. It gave the cap a purpose beyond vanity, elevated it into the realm of the sacred. People who believed this version were more afraid of the cap than those who believed the scar story, because they suspected the binding it protected was not for the king's benefit. It was for theirs. There were darker stories too. Stories told only in deep whispers, only at night, only between people who trusted each other with the kind of trust that takes decades to build. Stories that said what was under the cap was not a scar, not medicine, not anything that belonged to the world of men at all. Wanjiku did not believe any of the stories. She was 15 years old and practical in the way that children who have grown up poor are practical. She did not have the luxury of superstition, because superstition was for people who could afford to be afraid of things that might not exist. She was afraid of things that definitely existed. Hunger, for one. The king's temper, for another. Her mother's cough that had been getting worse since the dry season and showed no sign of improving. She had come to the palace at 13, brought by her uncle who served in the outer kitchen and who had leveraged a small favor to get her a position among the junior cleaning staff. She swept. She carried. She fetched water before dawn and stacked firewood in the afternoons. She was good at being invisible, which was the most important skill a person could have in that palace, and she had developed it with the same careful dedication that other children developed the skill of running or climbing out of survival, out of necessity, because the alternative was too costly. She had been inside the king's private sleeping chamber exactly 7 times before the morning everything changed. Each time, she had entered before dawn with 2 other girls, swept quickly, replaced the water in the clay pot by the window, and left without looking directly at anything she wasn't supposed to look at. She had learned the geometry of that room the way a person learns the geometry of a space they must move through in the dark, by feel, by memory, by the careful mapping of every object and its position. She knew the low wooden bed was against the east wall. She knew the king's sleeping robe was always folded on the chest at the foot of the bed. She knew there was a creak in the 3rd floorboard from the door that had to be avoided, and she knew the window on the north wall let in a draft that made the lamp gutter if you moved past it too quickly. What she did not know, on the 8th morning, was that the king had slept badly. He had tossed, apparently, in the hours before dawn, something that was entirely unlike him, something that the quality of his stillness in every prior morning had given no indication he was capable of. He had tossed, and in the tossing, the cap had shifted. Not fallen. Not come off. Shifted. Just enough. Just a fraction. Wanjiku was alone that morning. The other girl, Nyambai, had a fever and had been sent to the healer the night before, and the senior housekeeper had decided, at the last minute, that the 3rd girl was needed in the outer kitchen to help with the morning grinding. So Wanjiku entered alone, barefoot, careful, moving through the dim pre-dawn grey of the chamber with the broom in her hand and her mind already on the firewood she had to stack before the cook called for her. She swept the far corner. She crossed to the window. She lifted the water pot, testing its weight, and turned to carry it to the door. And that was when she saw it. She stopped. Her whole body stopped, the way a person stops when they hear a sound they cannot immediately identify, not with fear yet, just with a complete, absolute halt of all movement while the brain catches up with what the eyes are reporting. The king was on his back, as always. His breathing was the slow, heavy breathing of deep sleep. The cap had slid, not far, not dramatically, just a degree or two to the right, just enough to expose a thin crescent of scalp above his left ear. And in that crescent of skin, in that small dark sliver of the king's head that had never been seen by any living person in 31 years, something moved. Not the king. Not a twitch or a shift of sleep. Something beneath the skin. Something that moved with its own purpose, its own direction, slow and deliberate, a pale writhing that lasted only a second before it disappeared back under the cap's edge. The water pot hit the floor. Wanjiku did not remember dropping it. She did not remember crossing the room or opening the door or running down the passage. Her next clear memory was the cold air of the courtyard on her face and the sound of her own breathing, loud and ragged, and the grey sky above the palace walls going pale with the first hint of dawn. She stood there. She pressed her back against the courtyard wall. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to press them flat against the cold stone to make them stop. She told herself she had imagined it. The room had been dim. She had been tired. The light had been strange. People saw things in the early morning that were not there. She knew this, she had heard it said many times by sensible people. But the thing was, and this was the thing she could not argue herself past, no matter how many times she tried in the weeks that followed, she had not felt afraid until she had already seen it. The fear had come after, which meant it had not been the kind of thing the frightened mind invents. It had been the kind of thing the calm mind reports, and the frightened mind then runs from. Something was living under the king's cap. She never told a soul. She made that decision in the courtyard before the sun had fully risen, and she kept it for 11 days, which, as it turned out, was 10 days longer than she needed to keep it, because by the 11th day, she was not the only one who knew. The second person to see it was not a palace servant. He was a guard, a big, weathered man named Kamau Gitau who had served at the palace gate for 9 years and who prided himself on the fact that nothing surprised him anymore. He had seen too much in 9 years of service under Mwangi wa Thuita to retain the capacity for surprise. He had watched good men exiled for nothing. He had watched a mother flogged in the courtyard because her son had been caught stealing a handful of maize from the royal granary. He had watched the king sit through all of it with that flat, still face, and he had made his peace with the fact that the world contained such men and that some of those men became kings and that there was, functionally, nothing to be done about it. What he saw happened on a night of heavy rain, 6 weeks after Wanjiku's morning in the chamber. He was doing a late patrol of the inner corridor, something he rarely did but had been assigned that night because 2 of the regular night guards were ill. He passed the king's private study, a small room adjacent to the sleeping chamber where Mwangi wa Thuita sometimes sat alone in the late evenings, reading or simply sitting in the dark, a habit that the guards found unsettling but had long ago stopped remarking on. The door was open a crack. The lamp inside was still burning. Kamau Gitau was not a curious man. He had trained curiosity out of himself in his first year at the palace, the same way a dog trains itself not to flinch at the sound of a stick after it has been beaten with one enough times. He should have walked past. He had walked past that door hundreds of times without looking through it. But the sound stopped him. A sound he could not immediately identify, coming from inside the study, low and continuous, almost rhythmic. Not speech. Not the sound of pages turning. Something else. He looked through the crack in the door. The king was sitting at his table, alone, with his back to the door. The lamp threw a circle of amber light across the table and across the king's shoulders and across the back of the cap, that ever-present dark red cap, which sat on his head exactly as it always did, except the king's hands were raised. They were raised to the sides of his head, and his fingers were pressed against the cap, not gripping it, not lifting it, but pressing it down. Holding it in place. The way a person holds something in place that is trying to get out. And the sound, Kamau understood the sound now, understood it and wished immediately that he did not, was coming from beneath the cap. A soft, persistent sound. Like the sound of something that was alive and restless and not happy about its confinement. A shifting. A rustling. The faintest imaginable version of the sound that dry leaves make when something moves through them. The king was sitting completely still except for his hands, which were pressing against the sides of the cap with a quiet, desperate steadiness that was the most human thing Kamau Gitau had ever seen in 9 years of watching this man. There was no majesty in it. No authority. No flat-faced impassivity. There was just a man sitting alone in a lamplit room in the rain, holding his own head, and from the set of his shoulders, from the rigid line of his neck, it was clear that he was not doing it calmly. He was doing it the way a person does something they have been doing for so long that the effort has carved itself permanently into their body, with the exhausted, practiced endurance of someone who has been fighting a private war for decades and has no memory of what peace felt like. Kamau walked back to his post at the gate. He stood in the rain for a very long time. He thought about Njeru, the good elder, exiled for asking a gentle question. He thought about that mother in the courtyard. He thought about the sound. He told his wife that night. Just his wife. Swore her to silence with a fear so genuine that she did not doubt him for a moment. She told her sister 3 days later. Her sister told the woman who sold vegetables at the market at the end of their lane. And the woman who sold vegetables, who had been carrying the rumor that had started with Wanjiku's dropped water pot 11 days earlier, now had a second piece to add to it, a piece that changed it from gossip into something that felt, terribly, like truth. By the time the story had moved through the market, through the grinding circles, through the women washing clothes at the river bend, through the men sitting outside the beerhouse in the evenings, it had grown, as stories do, in the way that each person who carries a story adds something of themselves to it, a detail, an emphasis, a horror they themselves are afraid of and so transplant onto the story as a way of giving their fear a shape and a name. Some people said it was one worm. Enormous, coiled, the length of a man's forearm. Some said it was many a nest, hundreds, pale and bloated, woven into the king's scalp so deeply that they had become part of him, that his blood fed them, that the cap was the only thing keeping them from spilling out. Some said they had been put there by a curse. A rival chief, years ago, a man Mwangi wa Thuita had defeated and destroyed, who had sent a healer with dark knowledge to plant something in the king while he slept. And old Kamau Karuthi, not the guard, a different Kamau, the village medicine man who had lived at the edge of the settlement for 60 years and who people visited in desperation and then pretended they had not visited. Old Kamau Karuthi said nothing at all when people asked him. He just looked at them. And the looking was its own kind of answer, because it was not the look of a man who was skeptical. It was the look of a man who had been waiting for everyone else to catch up with something he had known for a long time. The king heard about the rumors on a Tuesday morning in the dry season, when the valley was dusty and hot and the cattle were thin. He heard it the way kings hear things, through an aide who reported it with the careful neutrality of a man trying to deliver bad news without being blamed for its contents. The aide stood in the outer hall and recited what the village was saying, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and when he finished he waited. The silence that followed lasted a very long time. Then the king said, quietly, "Find the girl." They found Wanjiku at the river, carrying water. 2 guards, no ceremony, no explanation. They brought her to the outer courtyard and made her kneel in the dust, and the king came out into the morning sun and stood before her and said nothing for a long time. Just looked at her with those charcoal eyes while she knelt with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and her head bowed and the hot dust of the courtyard pressing up through her knees. She thought, "This is where I die." She thought, "I should not have dropped the pot. If I had not dropped the pot they would never have known I saw it. It was the sound of the pot breaking that woke him and he looked at me before I could get out the door and he knew, he always knows, this is a man who always knows." She thought, Mama's cough. She thought, "I should not have told Nyambai." She had told Nyambai. Of course she had. Because Nyambai had come back from the healers and they had been alone in the courtyard stacking wood and Nyambai had said, "You look like you have seen a spirit," and Wanjiku, who was 15 and had been carrying the image of that pale writhing movement for 11 days without sleeping properly, had broken. She had told it in a whisper, in 11 seconds, and then immediately regretted it, and Nyambai had looked at her with enormous eyes and said nothing. But Nyambai had a mother who she told everything to, and Nyambai's mother had a neighbor, and the chain of mouths that had carried the story from that courtyard to the king's ear had moved with a speed that Wanjiku had underestimated. The king looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You were in my chamber." "Yes, my king." "You saw something." She understood, in that moment, with a clarity that surprised her given how afraid she was, that there was no correct answer to this question. Yes was a confession. No would be a lie that he would see through, and being caught in a lie before the king was worse than the truth. She said nothing. The king stepped closer. He crouched down so that his face was level with hers, close enough that she could see the fine grain of his skin, the slight tension in his jaw, the way the brim of the cap fell a shadow across his forehead. Up close, the cap looked older than it did from a distance. The dark red cloth had faded unevenly, darker in some places than others, with a quality that suggested it had been exposed to moisture repeatedly, sweat, or rain, or something else, and had dried and been pressed back into shape many times over many years. "You saw nothing," he said. Quietly. Without heat. The way a person states a fact about the weather. She looked up at him. She met those flat charcoal eyes for the first and only time in her life. "I saw nothing, my king," she said. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stood. He walked back toward the palace entrance without turning around. At the doorway, without looking back, he said, "She leaves the valley by nightfall." Wanjiku was on the road north before the sun reached its highest point. She was given no time to return to her quarters, no time to collect her possessions, no time to send word to her mother. One of the kitchen women pressed a bundle of food into her arms at the palace gate, doing it quickly, without meeting her eyes, the way you give something to a person you are afraid to be seen helping. And then the gate closed behind her and she was standing on the road in the noon heat with the food under her arm and the vast open country ahead of her and the palace behind her, and somewhere to the south, across 3 hills and a river, her mother with her worsening cough and no knowledge of where her daughter had gone. She did not cry. She started walking. She told herself she was lucky, because she was. She had been in that room. She had dropped the pot. She had seen the thing under the cap and lived to walk away from it, and if there was a lesson in that, if there was something she was supposed to take from it, she would work out what it was later, when she was far enough away that she could afford to think. The village was silenced. 20 lashes for anyone heard repeating the story. 40 for anyone who repeated it a second time. The king's soldiers walked the market lanes for 3 days, and the market went quiet in a way that markets should never be. No bargaining, no laughter, no children running between the stalls, just the careful mechanical transaction of buying and selling conducted by people who were making themselves as small as possible. But silence, as anyone who has tried to impose it on a village knows, is not the same as forgetting. The people of Karuthi went quiet the way a fire goes quiet when it has been covered with earth, banked down, compressed, still burning, waiting. And waiting was something the people of Karuthi had become extraordinarily good at. 3 rains passed. Then 4. Then 6. The children who had been young enough to find the whole thing merely frightening grew old enough to find it fascinating, and then old enough to find it political, and then old enough to understand that the fascination and the politics were the same thing. A generation grew up in the valley with the cap as a fixed feature of their reality, not questioned, not discussed, but present in the way that permanent injustices become present, woven into the fabric of daily life, invisible only because looking directly at it had been made too costly. The king aged. The valley could see it, even as he maintained the immovable public face. His hands, those long, careful hands, developed a tremor in his 7th decade. His steps became shorter, more deliberate. The palace women noticed that his appetite was decreasing, and then that he was sleeping longer, and then that he was not sleeping at all, just lying in the chamber in the early mornings with his eyes open and his hands raised in that position that Kamau Gitau's wife's sister had described to the vegetable woman 2 decades ago, pressing against the sides of the cap. As though the thing beneath it had grown stronger. As though the war he had been fighting alone, silently, in the dark of every room he had ever occupied, was finally tilting against him. In the 30th year of his reign, the king's eldest son, Thuita wa Mwangi, a serious man in his late 30s who had inherited his father's flat-faced composure but not his cruelty, or at least not the same kind, went to his father's chamber in the early morning and sat by the bed and spoke to him man to man, father to son, with the careful gentleness that the situation seemed to demand. He said, "Father, people are saying things. I am not asking what is under the cap. I am asking if you need a healer. I am asking if you are suffering. The king turned his charcoal eyes on his son and said nothing. The son waited. The silence stretched. And then the king said, in a voice that was quieter than Thuita had ever heard from him, quieter and rougher and strangely old, every man carries something no one else can see. You will learn this. The only question is whether it carries you first. Thuita Mwangi sat with that for a long time. He did not understand it fully. He thought perhaps he would understand it later, when he was older, when he had more experience of the world. He went away thinking about it, and the years passed, and he got older, and he found that he understood it more than he wanted to. The king's health broke in the 31st year. It broke the way very old things break, not suddenly, not with drama, but with a kind of slow final yielding, a loosening of something that had been held under enormous tension for a very long time. He stopped eating. His body thinned to almost nothing. He lay in the sleeping chamber that Wanjiku had swept so many years ago, with the window on the north wall letting in the same cold draft, and he lay on his back, as always, and the cap was on his head, as always, and his hands were no longer pressing against it because his arms had grown too weak for that. They lay at his sides. And above him, in the silence of the room, the palace women who watched through the night said they could hear, if they listened very carefully, if they held their breath and pressed their fear down and listened with everything they had, they said they could hear a sound. Low and continuous. Almost rhythmic. Coming from under the cap. His wives sat with him. His sons sat with him. The eldest wife, a woman named Wambui who had been married to him for 35 years and who had never once asked about the cap, not because she didn't want to know, but because she had made a calculation early in the marriage that knowing would cost her something she could not afford to lose. Wambui sat beside the bed and held his hand and watched his face and felt the tremor in his fingers even now, even at the end, that old familiar pressing motion, the ghost of a gesture, the body. Still fighting the fight that the mind was too far gone to consciously conduct. Let it go, she said softly, to the room, to the air, to whatever was listening. Let it go now. You can let it go. He died on a Wednesday morning, just before dawn, when the sky outside the palace walls was the color of old ash. His last breath was shallow and quiet. His hands stilled. His face, finally, after 31 years, relaxed into something that had no authority in it, no calculation, no war. Just a face. An old man's face. The room held its breath. Wambui stood. She reached for the cap. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times over so many years that she felt almost calm. Her hand was steady. She wrapped her fingers around the cloth, the dark red cloth, faded unevenly, still faintly warm, and she lifted. What she saw, she would never describe to anyone. Not fully. Not in the years that followed, not to her children, not to her grandchildren who asked, not to the palace healers who came immediately after and made their own examinations and went away with faces that gave nothing away. She would say only this, when pressed, when the asking became insistent enough that silence itself became an answer, she would say that what was under the cap was not the worst thing she had seen in 35 years beside that man. She had seen worse things. She had watched him do worse things. What was under the cap, she said, was just the proof. And then she would say nothing more. She would close her mouth and straighten her back and look out at whatever was in front of her, the valley, the hills, the ancient fig trees on the ridge, and her expression would do something complicated and private that the people watching her could never quite read. But what the palace women saw, the ones who were in the room, the ones who had been watching through the night, what they saw when Wambui lifted the cap was not something they could keep to themselves. It was not the kind of thing a person locks away. It moved through the valley in hours, faster than the rumors had ever moved, because this time it was not a rumor. This time it was a fact. This time there were witnesses. 12 of them. 12 different people who had been in that room when the cap came off, and every single one of them told it the same way, which is how you know a story is true, when the details do not shift or grow or shrink from one mouth to the next, when 12 people independently described the same thing with the same stunned, slightly disbelieving flatness of people who saw something that broke their framework for what was possible. They said his scalp was white. Not pale. White, the way things go white that have been covered and kept from light for 30 years. They said the worms were pale too, the color of old roots, and there were more of them than anyone had ever imagined in the worst version of the story, dozens, moving slowly in the grey pre-dawn light, disturbed by the sudden exposure, pressing against each other. They said the most terrible thing was not the worms. The most terrible thing was that in the moment the cap came off, in that first second of exposure, the king's face, that dead still face, that face that had not moved in hours, flinched. His dead face flinched. His body had been too far gone to do it consciously, but something in him had registered the exposure, some deep old part of him that was more reflex than person, and it had flinched. The way a person flinches when the thing they have been hiding is finally seen. And the room went so quiet that they could hear the sound of the worms. 12 witnesses. All saying the same thing. All with the same flat, slightly broken expression of people who had witnessed something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to fit into a shape that made sense. By noon, every person in the valley of Karuthi knew what had been under the cap. By nightfall, old Karuthi, the medicine man, the one who had been waiting for everyone to catch up, walked to the great Mugumo fig tree on the ridge above the valley. The tree that people said Mwangi wa Thuita had tried to have cut down 40 years ago, before he was king, back when he was nothing but the ambitious third son of an old chief, back when he had wanted to clear the ridge to build a cattle enclosure and had sent men with axes to the tree, and the men had come back with the axes unswung, saying they could not do it, saying the tree had looked at them. The king had been furious. He had gone up to the ridge himself, in his younger years when his body still had force in it, and stood before the tree with an axe in his hands. And something had happened there, in the time between him raising the axe and the axe never falling, something that nobody but Mwangi wa Thuita himself had known for certain. Something that had sent him back down the ridge without the cattle enclosure, without an explanation, and with a cap on his head that had not been there when he went up. Old Karuthi stood at the base of the tree in the evening light. He pressed his palm against the bark. He was quiet for a long time. The valley was spread below him, the huts and the cooking fires and the river gleaming in the last of the light. "He is gone," the old man said. To the tree, to the valley, to the air, to whatever was listening. The tree was still. Karuthi nodded slowly. His hand stayed on the bark. He thought about the king. He thought about 31 years of fear and silence and the particular poverty of a people who have been made afraid to hope. He thought about Wanjiku, wherever she was. He thought about old Njeru, wherever he was. He thought about Wambui, holding a dead man's hand in the grey dawn and feeling the ghost of a pressing motion in his fingers. He thought about what the tree had planted in that man's head, 40 years ago, on a morning when an axe was raised and then lowered. He thought about whether it had been punishment or warning or something more complicated than either, the tree's way of binding a man to his own cruelty, of making the inside of him visible, eventually, to everyone. Patient as only ancient things can be patient. He thought about the fact that the worms had still been moving after the king was gone. He closed his eyes. And then, in the gathering dark, standing at the root of the oldest tree in the valley, old Karuthi felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, exactly. Not peace. Something older than both of those things, something that did not have a precise name in any language he knew, the feeling that arrives when a thing that has been wrong for a very long time has finally, at enormous cost, been corrected. Not a good feeling. Not a comfortable one. Just a true one. Down in the valley, in the palace, the cap was being carried to the fire. The eldest son, Thuita wa Mwangi, had given the order himself, calmly, the moment he understood what had been in that room. He watched it burn from the courtyard doorway, the dark red cloth, faded and uneven, the thing that had defined his father's reign, the visible edge of a secret that had shaped every life in the valley for 31 years. He watched it burn until there was nothing left of it but a small pile of dark ash that the morning wind was already beginning to move. He stood there for a long time after the ash had scattered. He thought about what his father had said to him, in this same palace, in a room very close to this courtyard. Every man carries something no one else can see. The only question is whether it carries you first. Thuita wa Mwangi looked up at the ridge, at the great dark outline of the Mugumo fig tree against the evening sky, and he felt, without entirely understanding why, that it was looking back. He had decisions to make. The valley needed a leader. The people needed to know that the fear was over, that the silence was over, that they could speak again without counting the cost. He had spent 30 years watching his father rule and had learned, with the precision that proximity to power teaches, exactly how not to do it. He would bring Njeru's family back. He would find Wanjiku wherever she was, whatever shape her life had taken in the years since that morning with the water pot, and he would make it right, as much as anything like that could be made right. He would open the granaries that his father had taxed into surplus while the people went thin. He would do all of this. He told himself this in the courtyard as the ash scattered. But first, he looked at the ridge again. At the tree. His father had gone up that ridge with an axe and come back with a cap on his head, and had worn it until the day he died, and what had been growing under it had been there all along, patient and pale and moving, waiting for the moment of exposure that the king had spent 31 years trying to prevent. Thuita wa Mwangi found himself wondering, and this was the thought that would keep him awake that night, and the night after, and many nights in the years that followed. He found himself wondering what, exactly, his father had seen at the base of that tree. What had happened in the space between the raised axe and the unswung blow? What bargain had been offered, or what judgment had been rendered, or what seed had been planted, that had changed the entire course of a man, a king, a valley, a generation? And he found himself wondering, quietly, in the back of his mind, whether there was something waiting at the base of that tree that was not finished yet. Whether the tree, in its patience, had been waiting not just for Mwangi wa Thuita, but for whoever came after him. Whether Karuthi was free now, or whether the accounting had only just begun. He stood in the courtyard for a long time. The ash was gone. The fire was cold. Above the ridge, the stars were coming out, one by one, in the vast dark highland sky. And somewhere up there, in the dark between the trees, something was still. Something was waiting. And it had, as it had always had, all the time in the world. If this story got under your skin, you already know what to do: share it, and come back. The Valley of Karuthi is not done with its secrets.